Hey, this is John. How are you doing today? I'm going to continue on with building Tamiya's 148 Spitfire Mk, and this video will cover getting the fuselage, the wings, the tail planes all together and getting everything sanded and primed. The cockpit assembly has a small pin on the forward section right here, and then there's a notch here at the back. Those correspond, helpfully enough, with some alignment points in the fuselage half itself. So I'm going to place it there and carefully add the fuselage, the other fuselage half, if I can. There. Looks like it fits just right, which, given this is Tamiya, I would expect no less. If you do find that there's a bit of a gap here, right up here, when you try to push it together, it may be that the instrument panel parts are just a little too wide. It could be you don't have the alignment pin in the proper hole, so you may need to look on the underside and check that. But this fit looks pretty good, so I think I'll go ahead and glue that up. All right, I had the fuselage glued together, and the next step in assembling the fuselage, step 13, wants you to take this small piece here and glue it right there. Now I'm going to go ahead and do that because the Spitfire did not have a seam line along the top. Now, why Tamiya chose to do this part separate, maybe it has to do with the way the part is cut, I don't know. But why they chose to do it separate, I'm not real sure. But if you're building the model, you'll need to obliterate the seam along here, and the one that's introduced by this part here. Now there will be this gap here is okay, because that's where the top part of the cowl cover came off. But basically, the seam here and the seam all the way back to the cockpit needs to be eliminated. And of course, any seams along the spine of the fuselage and the underside. One other thing to note in step 13, there are two little bumps, part B6 and part B7, that need to be fitted to the cowling. I recommend that you not fit those parts until after you've dealt with the seam, because while one of them is off to the side and won't get hit by the sanding stick, the larger of the two bumps is right at the transition point between the side and the top, and it may get some attention, some unwanted attention from a sanding stick. So I recommend leaving these off until you get the seam line along the top of the cowl sorted out and smoothed over. For the tail plane assembly, Tamiya did us a favor. I've already assembled half of it here. They provide an upper piece, two upper pieces, and a single lower piece, which means when you set your tail planes in place, you won't have to be trying to adjust, are they level. They also put just the barest hint of a forward lip on it, so that where the two parts join is where there would be a natural seam line in the airplane itself. So you get a nice clean edge along the front, and once glued, and because of the good fit, you have essentially a panel line there that you don't have to worry about sanding away. So this little assembly was very cleverly engineered. All right, I have the tail plane assembled, and you notice it just slots right in there so that its alignment is perfect. You don't have to sweat that. On a lot of aircraft, you have to play with either side. Now, most of the time, you would just simply place the rudder right in there, and we're done, right? Right? Yeah. No. Tamiya has helpfully provided what is supposed to be one photo etch piece that folds up and goes in there. Now, while off camera, I had the joy of trying to sand off the little burr when you cut it away from the photo etch fret, and the piece broke. I'll be able to recover, but it's probably going to take a little bit of the Optivisor, some tweezers, and more than a few paratrooper words. But these parts slide in right here. Now, if you don't mind a little gap, because it's hardly going to be visible, you could just leave them off. Trust me, I've been sitting here thinking about leaving them off, because there's plenty of Spitfire kits that actually have gaps right there. And why Tamiya chose to do photo etch there, I'm not real sure, because they've used plastic inserts before and they work just as well. I'll be very frank, I find the use of mandatory photo etch in a kit to be extremely distasteful to me. And for Tamiya to be doing that, I'm seriously thinking, come on guys, no more of this nonsense. You're not Edward. You can do better than this. Anyway, I'll get that piece glued in and get the rudder on, and we should be about ready to move on to the wings. All right, I managed to get those photo etch parts glued on right back here, and I was unhappy the entire time I did it, but they did go on. Used some super glue. The rudder went on just fine, so once in place, it all works pretty good. There's a small actuator arm that goes right here between the fuselage and the rudder, and it's fairly flimsy. Almost every Spitfire I've ever built, I leave that off until the very end. I'll paint it while I'm painting the rest of it, but I'll leave it off till the very end. And when I'm adding the pitot tubes and the pitot tube and the antennas and all the other dangly bits that go on in the very last step, I'll put that in there, because when you're weathering the model, it can be, and when you're masking it off, it can be real easy to break that part. So I recommend leaving that off. The instructions tell me it's part A26, so I'm going to leave that off. But with that done, the fuselage is assembled, and I'll set it aside to let it dry for a day or two, and then I'll go back in and clean up the seam lines. All right, next major assembly is the wings, and I wanted to point out a few things. The instructions do a good job of pointing out where the undergating attachment points need to be cut off. So be sure and take care of those very well so you get a good fit. There's also a couple of small holes that need to be drilled out, because later on there'll be some parts that are of course going to be glued on the underside of the wing. So make sure you get those, or you'll be sad later on. I'm thinking that these are done because there's going to be later versions that don't have them. That's my guess. Also note that it gives you some color instructions depending on the version you've picked, so make note of that. For the actual construction of the wheel wells themselves. A lot of manufacturers are going to this multi-part assembly here like this. I recommend what I do, and this is what I recommend to make sure you keep it straight. Clip one part off the sprue at a time. I had a friend that said he clipped everything off, and he eventually figured it out because they go together well, but he said it was a little bit of a pain. So I'll be clipping these parts off one at a time and gluing them on so that it builds those assemblies. Then you'll glue those assemblies and this trough here, I don't know a better word for it, onto the lower part of the wing, plus the guns. A lot of people don't notice, but the outer guns on the Spitfire Mark 1s, the 8-gun wing Spitfires, the outer barrel's just barely poked out. So be sure and get those parts in there. You may want to just brush paint in some black paint on the insides, just so that it creates some shadow. And then the upper parts of the wings will go on the wingtips and the ailerons. So I'll get started on that. I've gotten one of the landing gear inserts assembled, and I wanted to show they've designed it in such a way that it's pretty much John proof. I was able to get it in with no problem. It's not glued yet. It's not glued to the wing. The parts are glued together. But what I recommend you do is before the glue sets too much, set it in place and just give it a firm push to make sure that all of those parts are aligned with the lower part of the wing, so that when you're looking in later, you eliminate the need or the chance for there to be gaps. Now I'm going to go on and do the other side, get the other parts put in, and then show you what that looks like. Okay, I've got the landing gear parts in place. I dry fitted it to see if it's better to put this centerpiece first and then the outer parts, or the outer parts and then the centerpiece, and I quickly found out it doesn't matter. They don't impinge on each other, so you can put them in whatever order you want. Just do make sure, as I'd mentioned, that you press down firmly when you got the glue on there, so that everything is in place. But they've done this really well. I mean, it's almost impossible to get them on there wrong. So the next step is going to be to add the upper wing parts on and continue on with the wing assembly. All right, I have the upper wing portions glued on. The fit is darn near perfect, which is what I would expect with Tamiya. Now, one thing to note, when you are putting these wing halves together, because they use undergating, you have to really clean those undergates up carefully. They put the undergating on so that it doesn't mar the front edge of the wing. Theory being you get a nice smooth edge that you don't have to clean up. Problem with undergating is, now that you've moved the cleanup point along the mating surfaces, if you don't clean that up really, really carefully, you'll introduce small gaps, which means you have to sand at the leading edge of the wing, which messes with the shape. Personally, I wish they wouldn't do undergating on wings. I find it much easier to clean up along the edge than trying to clean up along the mating surfaces. But just know that that's a point where you need to really be careful. But with careful cleanup, they fit together without any gap. Now, it's still going to need some sanding. There is a join there. To get a smooth edge, it will require sanding. So that's just something that can't be overcome. Anytime you're building this kit or any kit where there are wingtip parts and an aileron, I like to test fit. And in doing so, I see that there is just the tiniest gap right there between the wingtip and the aileron. I'm not a fan of separate control surfaces actually for that very reason. Even Tamiya, as good as their fit is, rarely gets the ailerons to fit absolutely perfectly. Now these are very good, but it could be improved. So the way I do, the way I treat that, five, four, I grab a little piece of plastic card, just some sheet styrene. I think this is 0.2 or maybe even 0.1, I'm not sure. I've already test fitted off camera to make sure that it works. But I'll just simply cut a little piece like that. I don't shape it. I'm not too terribly worried about shaping it. And I'll get my Tamiya glue, staying branded here, Tamiya Spitfire Tamiya glue. I'll put that on there. Now that's a really small contact surface, I know. And I'll make sure that it's lined up along this edge here where it meets the wing. And then I'll come back and I'll put it in. Perfect. Now, I have to give this aileron time to dry. So what I'll do is, after it's dried for a few minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and try and do it for the sake of camera. I may have to go back and redo it if it pulls apart. But what I'll do is I'll get in here and I'll snip most of the excess off with my nippers. And leave just that tiny amount there. And after I give that a little time to dry, I'll use a hobby blade to carefully carve it back to where it's flush with the rest of the wing, or as close as possible. I won't use a sanding stick, because if I use a sanding stick, it'll most likely pull that part off. Then, once it's on the wing, like this, I can then take a sanding stick and just lightly run it along the edge, because then it will be glued from both sides. It'll be much more stable, and it won't shear force won't pop it off, and I'll have closed up that little gap. Okay, I've added the ailerons and the wingtips with my little shim in there to correct the gap. There's a hairline gap here on the inside edge between the wing and the aileron. I'll use Mr. Surfacer to cover those over, and what I'll do is I'll just run a bead of it all the way along there and just take a Q-tip soaked in rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, and just clean off the excess there, just to cover that little bit of gap up. But otherwise the wing is looking pretty good so far. So I'll set that aside to dry and start working on the fuselage a little more. I have my Mr. Surfacer here. This is Mr. Surfacer 500. They also make Mr. Surfacer 1000 and I think Mr. Surfacer 1200. For this kind of gap filling, I recommend Mr. Surfacer 500 because it's just a little thicker. But all I'm going to do is I have an old 10-0 brush that's seen better days. And I'm going to get in here, and I apologize if my visor knocks the camera, but I'm just going to apply it fairly liberally in terms of depth, but confined in terms of width, right along this line here. Now when you apply Mr. Surfacer, at first it may look like it's completely covering up whatever you're putting it on. It will shrink down, it will fill into any gaps, it will flow into them, it will shrink up a little bit. So while this initial application is fairly heavy, it will level out just a bit. And I may have to go back later and put in a second coat. But the beauty of Mr. Surfacer is it will show you exactly where the gap is. You'll see it, and you can go in and fill that in. Now notice I'm avoiding covering up those little holes there, because later on we need those for additional parts. This is where I was talking about earlier that I don't know why Tamiya split that part out, because now we've got this gap here. Oh, there's a cat hair. What do you know? A little sand away too. We've got this gap here that is a little more severe, and we have to deal with that, so I'll put some along there. But when I move it around in the light like this, I can actually see more, the place is starting to appear as the Mr. Surfacer starts to settle. And I just go in and I add more so that I get a good, what I'm looking for is a good, essentially glossy look. Because if there's an indent, it will take away some of that gloss. But when I see just a rounded over glossy finish, I know I've got enough in there. Now I'll have to let this dry for 24 hours. Otherwise it'll start pulling away when I'm sanding it. But I'll just go around the rest of the seams and add this in, and I'm also going to put some in on the wings leading edges. So I'll go and do that and just give you a quick peek of what it looks like. I've gone through and added in Mr. Surfacer along the wings leading edge. And it doesn't take a whole lot. And I'll probably, because I'm already starting to see a few little, it's highlighting a few little gaps. I'll probably go back in and add some more, but I just did it along the entire leading edge. I'll wait to deal with the ailerons and the tiny hairline crack right here on the wingtips. I'll wait till I have everything fully assembled, because for those I'm just going to use cotton buds to get those off. I also did the fuselage. I added some more along here and there and on the underside. And I don't know if you can see, but there are still some tiny little just hairline cracks where it's sunk in. Now, it's probably above the level of the plastic. It's probably filled in enough that I can sand it, but I like to see nothing before I start sanding, so I'm a little I guess you'd say anal retentive about it. But I'll set that aside to dry for 24 hours, and then I'll start sanding it, and I'll show you a couple of things that I do there to try and minimize the damage to the rest of the surrounding plastic. I've gone ahead and added some Tamiya tape, just the thick stuff, the wide stuff, to the area that I'm going to be sanding here to protect the rest of the plastic. I've previously sanded away the Mr. Surfacer along the upper and lower surfaces here. Those were pretty simple. I didn't use tape to protect them because of the curve of the fuselage. It essentially protected itself. But this because it's pretty much flat. Needs a little bit of protection so that you don't, so that you avoid as much as possible flat spotting the top of the cowling. And you can see that I guess you can see that I've got that on there fairly heavily because I want to make sure that I get that taken care of well, because on a Spitfire, because the nose is so long and so flat, when you paint it, the chance of a seam kind of messing with the look of the whole model is fairly high. Especially if you're building this for a contest or something that's going to be judged. I can't tell you the number of times that I've looked on the tables at a model show to see the models that are there, and there's some good looking models, but if you lean over in just the right light, virtually every time you can see just the barest little hint of seam right along there on most Spitfires. So it's certainly something I'm not always perfect at it, but I try to take care of it because I've built enough to know that it's something to be aware of. Now for sanding, I'm going to start off, I've got these sanding sticks, a set of sanding sticks. I'm going to start off with a 400 grit sanding stick. This is a lot of stuff to have to take down with a 400 grit, but because I want to be as gentle with the underlying plastic as possible, I start off with something that light. You can start with a 240 or a 320 or whatever, and it will sand this down faster, but you're going to be possibly biting into the plastic also. It's one of the reasons I put down this tape, to avoid that. By starting with a 400, I know I'm setting myself up for a lot more work, but it should yield a better result in the end. So I'm going to go through and start sanding this with the 400 grit, and then when I've got it smooth from that, I'll do the 600 and 800, and that'll be good enough for priming and painting later. So I'll get started on that and show you what it looks like during the process. Okay, I've got the majority of that sanded down so that it's the test that I use is I drag a fingernail along it like that, and if I feel any kind of bump or just the slightest bit of resistance, then I know that I've still got a little more sanding to do, but this one is where I want it to be. Now you'll notice that the tape has sanded away here. That shows you some of the damage that you're saving the model from. So, you know, and if you're doing something that requires a lot of sanding, you may have to replace that tape on there twice. Now once I get it to this part where the 400 grit has got it smooth, I go ahead and remove the tape so that the next bit of sanding that I do will get it much smoother, because the 600 grit is not really going to remove plastic like the 400 grit can, or something that's even a lower grit. And the tape actually does prevent you from getting as far down as you possibly could, even though it's so thin. So by removing the tape, I'm going to be able to get in a little closer. Now what I will do, there's a little lump right there, a little bump, and I'm going to put just a small piece of tape right over the edge of that, just to protect it from getting smoothed off as I'm passing over it with the sanding stick. This is why I mentioned not putting those little bumps here, because they would really be in the way right now. So I'll grab my 600 grit sanding stick and polish this up, and then the 800 grit, and show you what it looks like. Well, I've run into a minor disaster, and this will happen from time to time on these long seams like this. As I was sanding, because you've got to put some pressure on it. As I was sanding, the glue joint cracked right along here. You can't it doesn't show, but it cracked right along here, which means no matter how much sanding you do, there's always some shift there, and you will not get that. You will not get that covered up. The rest is good. This passes the thumbnail test just fine. So what I'm going to have to do is go back in and very lightly apply a bead of super glue right along there, and then I'll put some super glue accelerator on it to dry it up, to cure it quickly, and then I'll sand over it. The reason I didn't do it from the beginning is it takes a while to sand super glue. Even if you start in on it just once it's cured with the accelerator, it still takes a while to do it, and it's not my favorite method, because usually after you've done the super glue you have to go back over it with some Mr. Surfacer, make sure that it's smooth again. It's just a little bit of a pain, but if you run into that problem, that's one of I've found it for me to be the best way to solve that, because it just absolutely covers up the gap and holds the piece together, and you get a perfectly smooth finish, but it takes a little bit of work. So I'll do that and show you what it looks like. Well, that was an exercise in frustration. I got it sanded. It's passes my fingernail test, so it's good to go, and I didn't alter the profile too much. I've built a lot of Spitfires, and I've always wondered why manufacturers didn't, because getting this area smooth and nice and then integrating the forward windscreen into the whole thing, I've always wondered why they didn't create a part somewhere along these panel lines that was clear, just so that you would put the whole thing in and it would be smooth. I've seen it, similar things done anyway. I've just always wondered why they don't do that. I've got it smoothed over. Like I said, it passes the fingernail test. I'll go back in with my razor saw and reestablish that panel line. But by deepening it, there's still a little bit of it there, so I'll have a groove to go into. So that's why I do that. It helps at times like this. I've already reestablished them here and on the underside. So now I'll be able to add in the fuel filler cap right there. I've got to do a couple of more little things to get it ready to mate up with the wing. And then we will proceed, well, I will proceed, you will proceed watching. I'll proceed with the build of Tamiya Spitfire. Okay, it's time for the ever crucial test fit of the fuselage to the wing. Now, Tamiya generally fits fairly well, but even Tamiya may not always be perfect. So first thing I do when I'm test fitting a wing is I just set it on there and see, okay, if I push it together, what does it do? So here towards the back of the wing root, it looks good, but you see there's something preventing it from seating without some additional force right there. So I push that down and it comes back up a little bit. Now, once I use force, the fit is perfect, but the fact that it's essentially resisting me tells me there's something in the way there. Now, if it were a little less resistant to pressure, I would just go ahead and glue it and hold it. Tamiya extra thin, I can glue that, hold it, in a few minutes it'll be solid and I can move forward. But what I've learned is when you get that much resistance, and it's just the barest bit, and I mean, it's a very subjective thing, but when you get that much, if you glue it and expect it to hold, it can mean later on that as you're weathering and as you're painting and as you're handling the model, it can pop loose. So what I do is I go through a process of essentially trimming up the bottom of the cockpit and these mating edges along here, making sure that it's not anything that's going to be visible once it's on the model. But what I'm looking for is I'm looking for whatever is resisting all of this coming together. I want to eliminate it on the inside there. It's a simple theory. If something doesn't fit, something's in the way. And I just go through a process of sanding away a little bit and testing the fit again and seeing if it helps. Now, you'll be able to figure out, you know, because I know that it's resisting towards the front, I know that it's something in this area. So I'll just use my knife and just shave away some of it and see where it helps. But all that being said, I'm going to go through, work through it a little bit at a time. And all I'm going to be using is my hobby blade and maybe my green sandy stick, because I can get right down into some precise areas. And I'm just going to keep working it a little bit at a time. I can't emphasize enough that this has to be a very slow, very deliberate process if you're wanting to get a good fit. But I'll work on that and show you the results when it's ready to go. All right, let's do another test fit after a little bit of sanding, and I'll show you what I did. Now if I put this on there, it sets on there almost perfect. And with just the slightest bit of pressure, it's 100% perfect. I can put some glue on that, hold it for about 30 seconds, and it'll be done. That's the point I was looking for. Now, what I did, and what I thought the suspect was, I figured this from the beginning, but I wanted to test it. This forward part of the cockpit was interfering with the fit down here. Exactly where, I don't know. But I cut away a little bit of the forward edge here and on the sides, and then I started in with this sanding stick, but that was taking a little long. So I realized I could get an angle with this 100 grit right here, and I just went at that puppy until basically I sanded this area smooth. Now, if this were any other brand, I would go, well, it wasn't great engineering. Because it's Tamiya, I'm assuming I did something wrong in the construction and everything didn't line up perfectly. Whatever the case may be, if you have any fit issues there, look to sand this down. Now you have to use very little pressure, because it's real easy when you're bearing down on this to shake something in the cockpit loose, to squeeze it so hard that you might pop the seam up here on the top. I was worried about that the entire time, but it went well. Just this area, anytime you've got a model that has the cockpit in there as a module like that, you know, if you look at it from the side, you can see there's things sticking down. It's those things sticking down to get in the way. So with that sanded, I've got a pretty good doggone fit there. So I'll get the wing glued on and move on. All right, the wing is glued on, and I've gone ahead and glued the radiator and the oil cooler. I did a rough paint of black on the inside, just so that the bare plastic won't be shining through. When I paint over it, I'll be able to shoot inside of it, dry brush the visible parts. There's not a lot of, in my experience, there's not a lot of point in detailing that in there, just unless you just really want to paint it. I wanted to point out how Tamiya handled the landing gear. The Spitfire had an odd arrangement of its landing gear. They joined here and they came down, but they were canted just a little bit, and then the tires were canted also. And getting that angle right on both sides and getting the forward rake, how they kind of tilted forward just a bit, is always a pain on most Spitfire kits. And I've built, I can't think of an exception, but I built every 48 scale Spitfire kit on the market. They're all they all present some challenges there. Tamiya approached this in an interesting way. They cast the landing gear as a single piece. Now it means you have to put it in before assembly, but that's okay, because in my mind, because once you put this in there, he says, as it won't go in, there it goes. Once you put this in there and you get those alignment pins, everything's set. The angles are set, the rake is set. It's very sturdy, it's very solid. And then you simply come in with these parts and pop them in. And because it's Tamiya, they fit perfectly. And now you've got your landing gear perfectly set and very stable. So this is one of the most unique landing gear arrangements I've ever seen, and I hope everybody else who does Spitfires will copy this method, because it works really, really well. So I'll get that glued in, and it's just about time to prime this. Won't be too much more to do after we get that glued in. All right, with that, I've got the underside pretty much finished up and ready for priming. I went ahead and glued on the landing gear doors also. I find that it can be a bit fiddly to avoid them, but you get a much better join gluing them ahead of time than trying to do it at the end of the process, so I've always done it that way. Everything fit very nicely. I would recommend using extreme caution when putting in this fuel filler cap. Tamiya left just 2 tiny little tabs for it to set on, and if you get it tilted and it falls through, you're going to have a devil of a time getting it out of the inside of the fuselage. In fact, I should have put it on before I ever put the wings on, but I forgot to do that. So make note of that if you're building this. Put that little cap on before you put the wings on, so you won't have any trouble. I've got a few more things to do before it's ready for priming, putting on the antenna, getting the clear parts on. But for the most part, that's the assembly of Tamiya's Spitfire. And with just a little exception of needing to do a little sanding underneath on the cockpit assembly, which may have been construction error on my part, this thing goes together beautifully. This is how I wish every aircraft kit were done. So I'll do a few more steps and show you what that looks like, and then get it primed. All right, I have the Spitfire ready to be primed. Let me show you some of the things that I did in getting it there. I've added the clear canopy parts here. You'll note, if you're building the open canopy version, Tamiya provides 2 inserts for this upper fuselage. If you're building the closed canopy version, there's a little part that goes underneath this canopy that joins the headrest back here. On the closed canopy version, it's cast into the canopy, so I recommend painting that the interior color right along inside of there. This forward canopy is actually 2 pieces. I'm not entirely thrilled with the arrangement. It allows them to have the different types of armored glass or non-armored glass on the front that was present on early Spitfires. So you have to put on this first canopy piece, and then this armored piece goes over it. It fits fairly well, but having to glue the clear parts is a little dicey. I put some Tamiya extra thin along here and just up here at the join where I thought it would be hidden by the mirror, and then masked it off. I ended up going in and putting in a little more filler, a little more Mr. Surfacer along here. I just wasn't happy with the way it was looking there. I also did Mr. Surfacer along the the various join lines, rubbed it down with alcohol. It looks a little severe, but it's flat, it's just stained. Under primer it'll go away. On the underside, I went ahead and assembled the landing gear. I went ahead and put the landing gear doors on. Early on I had painted this interior green. I forgot that it's going to end up being the wing color, so I'll just paint over that. The inside of the radiator and the oil cooler, I just rough painted those black. They'll get additional paint later, but it'll be just a little bit that you can get in with a brush easily. And one thing to note, I've still got to sand this down. I'm letting it dry. On any Spitfire model, the join between the back half of the lower part of the wing and the fuselage is always a problem. It was a very weird shape on the Spitfire, and capturing it in plastic is really hard. I recommend that you just simply leave these lines here alone, because in some reference photos I've seen, it fits to have them there. So just leave those alone and simply sand out this one part right there, and you should be good to go. But I've also got the other dangly bits, I guess you'd say, the exhaust, the prop, pitot tube, the rudder control, the door, the wheels mounted up on a toothpick, the sliding canopy portion masked off top and inside so that nothing will get on the inside. Minor note on the Spitfire's door that opened up. The early ones didn't have it, but some later ones had a crowbar. Those weren't red. I know people love to paint them red, but if you're worried about accuracy, they weren't red. During wartime, they were either silver, black, or the interior color. The red ones only came along later with restorations. So no more painting the crowbars on the Spitfire doors red. Please. Thank you. Public service announcement. All right, I'm going to sand off that last little bit on the underside, and I'm going to take it into my airbrush room and do some priming and show you what it looks like. Okay, I have primed the Spitfire. I used Badger's Stynylrez primer. I mixed in a little bit of their gray with the white primer. Because I was going to be painting the underside, part of the underside, one wing on the underside will be white. The fuselage will be silver. I would normally prime in white because of that. However, white doesn't photograph very well, so I added just a touch of gray to the primer just for photography purposes, so that it'll show up nicely. But the next steps, of course, will be the painting and the weathering, so that'll be the subject of the next video. Overall, I've been fairly happy with the construction of this new tool, Spitfire. I mentioned it, and I'll probably mention it a few more times. I'm not entirely thrilled with the mandatory use of photo etch parts. I don't think a single photo etch part on this kit was necessary. It fits together so well, and the photo etch fits well. I don't want to make it sound like it's a reason not to build it. If you've got a few kits under your belt, you're comfortable with photo etch, it's absolutely easy. Tamiya's photo etch fits like you would expect Tamiya stuff to fit. But I don't think any of it was necessary. They've made some clever engineering choices with the plastic to allow the canopy to be open for the landing gear. I think they could have done just as well to cast all the parts in plastic, or at least have alternatives. So it's not a kit that I would recommend. Unlike the old toolkit, this is not a kit that I would recommend for a beginner. Again, it wouldn't be difficult, but I would not want to recommend a kit and have someone get frustrated and not proceed in the hobby just because they didn't like using the photo etch parts. So, but aside from that, it's everything you'd expect from Tamiya. Great surface detail, great fit, certainly looks the part, and some really, really clever engineering to make it all come together. So that'll do it for this video. As I said, the next one will cover the painting and the weathering. I'll focus mostly on the weathering of the kit because, you know, painting it is painting it. I'm not sure that there's too much value in me demonstrating how to paint something. I may do a little of it, we'll see. But thank you for watching this video. Thank you for being a patron. This is a Patreon exclusive video, so if you would do me the courtesy of not sharing the YouTube link to this video, but rather the Patreon link, I would be most grateful. And thank you so much for supporting me in my work. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.